The restaurant occupied the corner of Madison and 42nd, the kind of place where tables cost more than they should, and waiters disappeared the moment your plate touched the tablecloth. I'd researched it carefully before committing to the reservation, not because I was nervous about first dates, but because I'd learned long ago that venue selection said everything about a person's intentions. Safe ground, public visibility, plausible deniability. Gabriel Marino's profile suggested someone who understood these calculations. I arrived at 7:47 p.m., 13 minutes early. The habit came from years of working in restaurants, where punctuality separated professionals from amateurs. The hostess greeted me with practiced warmth, the kind that suggested she'd memorized the script decades ago. My reservation was already flagged. Table 12, by the window. They seated me immediately, and I settled into the chair with my back to the wall. Another habit I hadn't bothered to break. The rain had started while I was driving, not the gentle kind that suggested autumn renewal, but the aggressive kind that made visibility difficult. Water streaked down the window beside me, distorting the city lights into impressionist abstractions. I'd mentioned to Gabriel in our messages that I loved rainy evenings. Something about the way weather forced people to be honest, to stop pretending they had anywhere else to be. He'd responded with a single emoji, a heart. The brevity had struck me as either confident or lazy. I was still deciding which. My phone buzzed. A text from my editor at the paper. Alderman Price's wife just lawyered up. Something's moving. I set the phone down without responding. Work could wait 3 hours. Investigation was my obsession, but it wasn't supposed to be my entire existence. That's what my therapist had said during our last session, delivered with the kind of gentle inevitability that suggested she'd rehearsed it many times before with many women like me. At 8:04 p.m., the hostess appeared with a man following behind her. I registered the face first. Dark hair, sharp jawline, the kind of facial structure that looked like it had been designed with precision. The pictures had been accurate, but everything else was wrong. The way he moved through the restaurant suggested ownership rather than invitation. His posture didn't contain the careful neutrality of someone on a first date. This was someone accustomed to being observed, and entirely unbothered by it. He sat down before the hostess finished her introduction, pulling the chair out without waiting for confirmation that I was actually the woman he was meeting. Up close, I could see the scar, a thin line running from the corner of his left eye toward his cheekbone, the kind that suggested old violence rather than recent accident. "You're Valentina," he said. Not a question. His accent was Italian, but not the studied kind that Americans sometimes affected. This was authentic, the language of his childhood emerging from the back of his throat like something he'd never bothered to conceal. "I'm Lucas. Gabriel's my brother." The waiter appeared immediately, as though summoned by proximity. Lucas ordered scotch without consulting me, without even glancing at the wine list. Neat. The efficiency of it felt like a message, though I couldn't yet determine what message it was trying to send. "Your brother didn't mention a twin," I said. "Gabriel mentions what serves him." He pulled out his phone and slid it across the table. My own face looked back at me, pulled from an article I'd published 6 weeks ago about municipal corruption and alleged organized crime connections. The photo was professional, taken outside a courthouse where I'd been waiting for a source who never materialized. "This is from your investigation into Alderman Price. You mentioned organized crime in the article but didn't have actual proof. Just suspicion and documentation of unusual financial flows." My body went very still. I'd learned to recognize the moment when something shifted from casual to dangerous, and this was it. "How do you know what I was investigating?" "Because I've been following your work for 3 months. He drank half the scotch immediately, then set the glass down with mechanical precision. "Everything you publish is vetted through multiple sources before it reaches print. You don't just throw accusations around. You build cases, which means you already know about the Ndrangheta expansion into this territory, but you're missing the connective tissue that would make it publishable." The restaurant seemed to recalibrate around us. Other conversations continued. Other couples leaned toward each other across candlelit tables. But in our pocket of space, something significant was happening, and I was only beginning to understand its dimensions. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Because my brother thought you were interesting. I think you're useful." He leaned back in his chair, and the casual posture didn't match the intensity of his eyes. "People like you, journalists with actual ethics, which is rare, you don't stop investigating when you hit an obstacle. You keep pulling threads until everything unravels. I want to see what happens when someone like that gets access to real information instead of the sanitized version that filters through official channels. And why would you provide that information? Because the Ndrangheta is becoming a problem I need to address, and your investigation into them could accelerate my timeline in useful ways." He finished the scotch. "We want the same thing. We just haven't admitted it to ourselves yet." The rest of the evening moved through sequences that felt both entirely natural and deeply calculated. He ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted. I ate it anyway, and somewhere in the middle of the meal, I stopped resenting the decision. He asked about my childhood in a way that made me realize I was answering questions I'd learned never to answer on dates. About my divorce 2 years ago. About why I'd chosen journalism. About what I believed in. He offered nothing in return. No reciprocal vulnerability, no personal details. Just observation and the occasional comment that suggested he'd already researched everything I was telling him. By the time the check arrived, I understood that something had fundamentally altered. This wasn't a date. It was an audition, and I was being evaluated for a role I hadn't auditioned for. His hand moved toward the leather folder, but I stopped him. "Why contact me through Gabriel?" I asked. "Why not approach me directly?" "Because I needed to know if you'd show up. If you'd be curious enough to wonder what happened when someone else arrived at your table." He pulled out cash. Old money. Hundreds. Far more than the bill required. "My brother thinks I'm making a mistake. Gabriel believes in redemption arcs and second chances. I don't. I believe in people acting according to their nature. And I think your nature is to investigate things until you understand them completely. That's useful to me." "And what happens after I understand?" I asked. "That depends entirely on what you decide to do with that understanding." He stood, adjusting his jacket with the kind of precision that suggested it was tailored to his specific measurements. The rain outside had intensified, and the window now looked like an impressionist painting that had lost coherence. "My number is in your phone, by the way. Don't ask how it got there. Just know that I can reach you whenever necessary, which means you should assume I always know where you are." It wasn't presented as a threat. It was just information, delivered with the same tone someone might use to explain that the sun rose in the east. He left before I could respond, moving through the restaurant like a man who'd never questioned his right to occupy space. I stayed on the sidewalk until the rain braided itself into my hair. Across the street, a woman leaned out of her window and beat a rug like she was teaching it a lesson. A dog barked in an apartment without a dog. The city does that when it's listening. Throws back echoes that don't belong to you. I wrote a note in my phone. "If you're a variable, learn the equation." Then I turned it off and walked inside. I sat there for nearly 20 minutes after he departed, my wine glass still half full, the rain continuing its assault on the windows. I should have felt violated. Violated was the appropriate response to being researched, tracked, contacted through deceptive channels. Instead, I felt something closer to exhilaration, the sensation that I'd just glimpsed the beginning of a story that would demand everything from me before it ended. The first thing I did after leaving the restaurant was drive home in the rain without the radio on. My apartment was in a converted warehouse in Dumbo, Brooklyn, the kind of neighborhood that had been industrial 20 years ago and was now gentrifying with the deliberate pace of capital finding its next opportunity. The stairs creaked in a way that suggested they'd never been properly maintained, and I climbed them while my mind was still processing the encounter. I sat at my kitchen table, a salvaged door balanced on concrete blocks, and opened my laptop. My hands moved through the familiar sequence. Browser, search engine, name, Lucas Marino. The results populated immediately, and what I found was simultaneously nothing and everything. Rain pinned Brooklyn flat to the earth the way a thumb pins a moth, gentle only from far away. I walked Dumbo's warehouse blocks at noon and again at dusk, talking to owners who knew how to smile without saying anything. The deli on the corner had changed hands 3 times in 18 months. Each sale was a transfer to an LLC with a Calabrian surname and a registered address that belonged to a mail drop on Nassau Street. The current owner poured coffee with the focus of a surgeon, while his nephew hovered near the door, pretending the street needed guarding. "Business is steady," the owner said, which in New York meant, "I don't want to talk in front of a stranger." "Steady like a heartbeat or steady like a metronome?" I asked. His mouth twitched. "Metronomes keep time. Heartbeats tell you who's still alive." Outside, a boy chalked a hopscotch grid into the sidewalk cracks. The nephew stared too carefully at my shoes. On my walk back, a sedan idled at the hydrant, music low. When I stopped to tie my laces, the driver's gaze slid off me the way oil slides off rain. 2 blocks later, the sedan rolled past with the slow inevitability of a tide. It turned at the next light. I wrote the plate down and pretended it didn't shake me. Journalism had taught me to file fear where it couldn't interrupt the work. Tonight, fear went in a drawer labeled Later. There were business registrations under his name. Property holdings scattered across the city. Legitimate companies with Italian names that meant nothing without context. Import-export businesses listed with addresses in the financial district, but nothing that suggested organized crime. Nothing that connected him to the Ndrangheta expansion I'd been investigating for 3 months. I searched deeper. Court records, municipal filings, news archives going back a decade. For someone who supposedly ran criminal operations in this city, his digital footprint was suspiciously clean, which meant either he was extraordinarily careful or Gabriel had been exaggerating his brother's significance. The next morning, I contacted my editor at the newspaper. Margaret Reyes had been the Metro reporter who'd given me my first real break 3 years ago, when I was freelancing from a coffee shop and thought having a byline was the end goal rather than the beginning. She was still the person I trusted most professionally, even if our relationship had become increasingly complicated by the reality that her job was managing my ambitions rather than supporting them. "I need to meet," I said. We sat in her office an hour later. The newsroom sprawled behind us through the glass walls. Reporters at desks, the constant low murmur of phones and keyboards, the particular energy of people who believed they were discovering truth for a living. Margaret took off her glasses the way people do when honesty is about to cost them something. "You can't publish what you can't source, and you can't live with yourself if you publish what you didn't verify," she said. "You're good because you're stubborn. Be careful who learns to use that. You think someone is using me. I think someone already is." She tapped the manila folder between us. "You don't owe your source belief. You owe your readers proof." I thought about the scotch at the restaurant, about the way Lucas ordered without looking at the menu like menus were for people who needed permission. What if the proof exists, but comes with a cost I can't ask a source to pay? Then you pay it yourself, she said softer. But you never ask the city to pay it in your place. In the glass wall's reflection, the newsroom became a mosaic of moving parts. Phones, shoulders, wrists, blinking cursors. I could feel the story assembling inside me like scaffolding going up around a building that already existed. She didn't question the public value of the work, only the chain of custody that delivered it to me. "Truth still needs provenance," Margaret said. And I heard in her voice a respect that could coexist with refusal. "Ndrangheta expansion," Margaret said, reading my notes. "You've got municipal corruption, money trails, business acquisitions in neighborhoods that don't match their legitimacy claims, but you don't have the connective tissue. That's what I'm missing," I admitted. "Something that ties all of this together and makes it publishable instead of speculative." "Then don't publish yet." She leaned back in her chair, which squeaked in protest. "Build the case, find the connections, and find a source who can verify what you're already suspecting." 3 weeks passed in the particular kind of obsession that journalism demands. I interviewed small business owners in the neighborhoods where Ndrangheta had acquired property. I examined property transactions dating back 5 years. I contacted city officials who either wouldn't return my calls or returned them with the scripted caution of people who'd learned never to go on record. I published nothing during that time, which felt like a betrayal of my training. The impulse to get the story out was constant, but the integrity that Margaret had instilled in me demanded proof before proclamation. During that 3rd week, Gabriel Marino contacted me through the dating app. His message was direct. "My brother mentioned your work. I think we should talk." We met at a coffee shop in the afternoon, which felt appropriately casual for a first meeting that was anything but casual. Gabriel looked like Lucas in the way that twins do. Same facial structure, same dark hair, but with a completely different energy. Where Lucas had contained his presence, Gabriel expanded into the space around him. He was warm in the way that Americans were taught to be warm, and it made me immediately suspicious. Lucas doesn't typically take interest in people, Gabriel said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. He's been isolated since... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Since someone he cared about died. That was 7 years ago. A car accident. He's been different since then. Harder, more controlled. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I want you to understand what you're walking into. My brother isn't safe, but not in the way you might think. He's not violent toward people he's decided to protect. But he's also not the kind of man who forgets things. And he's definitely not the kind of man who lets go. And what exactly is your brother? Gabriel set down his coffee cup with the care of someone handling something fragile. He's the person who runs most of the organized crime infrastructure in this city. Not because he wanted to, but because he was born into a family that had no other options for him. The Ndrangheta started moving into our territory 6 months ago. They thought they could take what we've spent decades building. My brother had other ideas. Why tell me this? Because Lucas already decided you should know. Because my brother has a plan. And you're part of it whether you've accepted that or not. And because I'm asking you, as someone who actually cares about my brother's well-being despite his own indifference to it, to be careful with the information you're gathering. I spent the rest of that week writing. The article I produced was careful. It mentioned organized crime expansion without naming Lucas or his operations specifically. It discussed municipal corruption and property acquisitions that defied economic logic. It implied Ndrangheta involvement without proving it. It was publishable because it was true, and because the truth was damning enough without requiring me to expose the infrastructure that Gabriel had just admitted to. The newspaper published it on a Sunday morning. By Sunday evening, Lucas Marino was standing outside my apartment building. I only noticed him because the doorway to my building framed a figure in charcoal gray, motionless in the drizzling rain. When I approached, he looked up from his phone like he'd been waiting for me specifically, like he'd known I would eventually come down the stairs and find him there. Your article was competent, he said. You didn't name anyone. You didn't provide evidence that would force prosecutorial action, but you told enough truth that the right people are now paying attention to the Ndrangheta's position in this city. How did you know where I live? I asked, although I already knew the answer. I've known since our first meeting. He stepped closer, and I didn't step back. The question is what you're going to do now that you understand what your investigation has opened. Because you've made this situation move faster than I planned. And now people are going to start taking action that wasn't supposed to happen for another month. I wrote what I believed was true. I know. That's why I'm not angry. He pulled out his phone and showed me an encrypted message thread I couldn't decipher. The Ndrangheta just moved their timeline forward. They're planning operational escalation, because your article made their position visible to law enforcement. Which means things are about to become significantly more complicated for everyone involved. What do you want from me? I asked. Right now, I want you to stop investigating. I want you to sit with what you know and wait. And I want you to understand that the protection I offered you at dinner was never conditional on your cooperation. It was a decision I made, and it stands regardless of what you choose to do next. He left before I could respond, walking into the rain with the same confidence he'd walked through the restaurant. I stood on the sidewalk watching him disappear, understanding that something had shifted again. That the investigation I'd started as a professional pursuit had become something significantly more dangerous and significantly more personal. The phone call came 3 days after Lucas left me standing in the rain outside my apartment building. Unknown number, which I answered anyway, because I'd stopped believing in careful boundaries the moment I'd realized who he actually was. Meet me at Caffeine House on 10th, Lucas said without preamble. 1 hour. The cafe was crowded in the way that downtown cafes are crowded on weekday afternoons. People with laptops pretending to work, students cramming for exams, professionals killing time between meetings. I arrived early and ordered coffee I didn't want, positioning myself at a corner table where I could see the entrance without appearing to watch it. The barista, a woman with inked vines on her wrists, slid a receipt toward me that had nothing printed on it. A moment later, a busboy knocked his shoulder into my chair, apologizing in the universal language of service work. My bag had shifted an inch toward the aisle. His hand had not touched it. When Lucas took the chair opposite mine, the busboy vanished. The barista pretended to miscount the till. "Little tests," Lucas murmured without looking away from me. "Yours or theirs?" "Everyone's. People audition for roles they don't know exist." A man at the door tried to read my screen from 15 feet away. A ridiculous angle for useful surveillance. The barista refilled my coffee twice without charging. When Lucas left, the busboy reappeared with a broom and a message I wasn't supposed to notice. "You dropped this." Paper folded into eighths. Inside, a single line in block capitals. "They're listening by the plants." I glanced at the ficus near the restroom and wondered when I'd stopped assuming public spaces belonged to the public. Lucas arrived exactly on time, which seemed to be his default setting. He didn't order anything, just sat across from me with the kind of presence that made the surrounding noise seem distant. "The Ndrangheta knows you're investigating them," he said, "which means they know who you are, which means you're now a variable they need to eliminate or control." "How do you know that?" I asked. "Because I have people inside their organization who report to me. Because they've been moving money around trying to figure out which of their associates might be talking to you. Because 3 of their operatives were photographed outside your workplace yesterday." He leaned back slightly. "You're in danger. That's not theoretical anymore. That's active." My instinct was to argue, to claim that investigative journalists dealt with danger as a matter of course, but something in his certainty made that argument seem childish. "What do you want?" I asked instead. "I want to move you somewhere safer while you finish your investigation. Somewhere that the Ndrangheta can't reach you. Somewhere they'll understand is protected. In exchange for what? Exclusive access to information about their operations in this city. Nothing that will force action from law enforcement immediately, but everything that will help you build the case that your editor has been asking you to build." He pulled out his phone and showed me financial records I didn't recognize. "These are from their acquisition of commercial real estate over the past 18 months. They're consolidating territory. By summer, they'll control 40% of the downtown commercial property market." "You expect me to publish information you provide?" I asked. "I expect you to verify it independently and then publish what's true. I don't care about the spin. I care about the outcome, which is the Ndrangheta's position in this city becoming so visible that law enforcement is forced to act. Why not go to the police directly? Because the police in this city have structural corruption that runs deeper than individual officers. Some of them are paid by the Ndrangheta. Some are just competent enough to know when information was leaked and by whom, and some are honest enough that revealing everything to them would compromise my own operations." He stood up. "You have 72 hours to decide. After that, the decision gets taken out of your hands." He left without waiting for a response, and I sat there with my cold coffee trying to calculate probabilities that had no basis in reality because I didn't actually know what I was calculating. That night, I called Gabriel. He agreed to meet me at the same cafe the following morning. "I won't lie to you," Gabriel said when he arrived. "My brother doesn't take interest in people casually. He's isolated since his girlfriend died in a car accident. 7 years ago now. He's been different ever since. More contained, more strategic about every interaction. The fact that he's offering you protection and information suggests he sees you as someone worth investing in. What does that mean practically? It means he's serious. It means whatever he's offering, he'll follow through on. And it also means he's probably not going to let you go if you decide to accept." Gabriel stirred his coffee. "But it also means that while you're under his protection, nothing happens to you without consequences he decides to impose." Over the next week, Lucas and I met in increments. First in the cafe, which was public and safe. Then at restaurants where we occupied quiet corners. Then at a hotel bar where the dim lighting and ambient noise created isolation within crowds. "I have a place," he said during the 3rd meeting. "Temporary accommodation. You can work from there, receive visitors if you want, live your life. But nothing from the outside world reaches you without going through my people first." "You mean you read all my mail?" I said. "I mean I protect you comprehensively. That requires knowing what's coming toward you." He slid a key card across the table. "It's a hotel suite. Extended stay arrangement. No one questions how long you'll be there. And when I'm done investigating, we renegotiate. I packed a suitcase the following morning without really understanding why I was doing it. My boss at the newspaper asked if I was working on something significant, and I said yes, which was technically true. I didn't explain the nature of the significance. The hotel suite was on the 43rd floor of a building with security that made airports look casual. 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, a workspace where I could set up my laptop. A view of the city that made it seem like something I could hold in my hands. The first housekeeping attempt arrived at 11:03 a.m., exactly 3 minutes after I'd hung a "Do Not Disturb" sign. The woman at the door wore the hotel uniform and a pin with someone else's name. When I asked for her supervisor, she smiled the way mirrors smile, reflecting me back without warmth, and pushed the cart an inch forward. "I don't need service," I said. "I understand." She didn't move. Down the hall, the security camera blinked to life. Lucas had explained the system once, but I hadn't understood the parts I wasn't meant to touch. I texted the number he'd hidden in my phone and wrote only, "Housekeeping." 3 minutes later, a real supervisor arrived with 2 men who knew how to stand without pretending to be furniture. The woman with the borrowed pin apologized again and left without asking me to sign anything. "This will happen again," the supervisor said. "We'll widen the perimeter." "Is there a perimeter on a corridor?" "There is now." When the elevator doors closed behind them, I realized I'd been holding my breath long enough to make stars gather at the edge of my vision. I sat on the carpet and breathed until the stars went away. I built a tiny ritual for aftershocks. Count 5 breaths, catalog 3 sounds, touch 2 solid edges. It was nothing anyone would call bravery. It was simply a way to teach my body that the floor was still the floor. Gabriel came by the first evening with groceries and explanations about how the security system worked. He showed me which phones were monitored by Lucas's people and which weren't. He told me that meals could be delivered, or I could go out with security. He made it clear without actually stating it that I'd entered a gilded cage, but one that was infinitely more comfortable than the danger I'd been flirting with. "He's not a bad person," Gabriel said before he left. "He's just someone who learned a long time ago that control is the only real safety. And now he's trying to extend that to you." Over the next 2 weeks, Lucas came by regularly. We'd sit at the kitchen table and he'd provide me with documentation about the Ndrangheta's operations. Bank records, property transfers, names of municipal officials who'd been paid to look the other way. Each document came with context, with explanation of what it meant and how it connected to the larger picture. I verified everything independently before accepting any of it. I called sources who were willing to speak on background. I cross-referenced public records with the information Lucas provided. Nothing contradicted anything else. Everything was real. The ADA picked the least romantic place in Manhattan for an off-the-record conversation. A fluorescent-lit conference room in a public library branch that smelled like old paper and cheap soap. She introduced herself by first name only and placed a single folder on the table like an altar offering. "These are sealed warrants," she said. "I'm not showing you anything unlawful, and I'm not asking for anything in return. I'm asking you to understand timing. If you publish names too early, the cases die. How early is too early? Any time before we can make the story survive a courtroom." She watched me read without reading me. On the last page, a list of shell companies matched the notes Lucas had given me. Names like ghosts that refused to haunt the right houses. "You didn't get this from me," she said. "I didn't get anything," I agreed. And for once the lie felt like a vow instead of a betrayal. "Why are you doing this?" I asked him during one of these sessions. "Because the Ndrangheta is a problem that's grown large enough to be unsolvable through private negotiation. Because I need them exposed and dismantled. Because you're someone who can do that while I continue operating." He didn't look at me while he answered. "And because I decided to take interest in you, which means I'm going to do what I can to keep you alive and functional." By the 3rd week, I'd stopped counting the days. I'd stopped thinking about my apartment or my former life. I'd become someone who lived in a hotel suite on the 43rd floor, protected by men I never saw, writing articles that would eventually destroy an organization that neither Lucas nor I could dismantle individually. "When do you let me out?" I asked him one evening. "When it's safe, or when you decide it's not worth it anymore and leave anyway." He was closer than he usually allowed himself to be. "Your choice." It doesn't feel like much of a choice. No. But it's more choice than you had before I decided to protect you. 4 weeks into living on the 43rd floor, I developed routines that made the hotel suite feel less like a prison and more like a deliberate retreat from the world. I woke at 6 in the morning regardless of when I'd fallen asleep. I worked from the kitchen table. Articles researched, verified, written. I took showers that lasted longer than necessary. I read books I'd never found time for before. I existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for something to shift. Lucas arrived most evenings around 7, sometimes with documents for me to review, sometimes with information that required context only he could provide, sometimes with nothing but the intention to sit across from me at the kitchen table while I worked. He never stayed past midnight. He never crossed into the second bedroom. He operated within boundaries that were rigid and invisible simultaneously. On a Tuesday during week 3, he brought financial records that implicated a city council member in money laundering connected to the Ndrangheta's real estate acquisitions. The documents were pristine, copies of bank transfers, property deeds, the entire architecture of corruption laid bare in spreadsheets and official stamps. "This is publishable," I said after reviewing the material for 2 hours. "It's completely accurate," Lucas confirmed, "and it will destroy his political career if you choose to release it." I set the papers down carefully. "What's the catch?" "There isn't one. I'm providing information that happens to be true. What you do with it is your decision. I didn't publish it. Instead, I buried it in my research file, cross-referenced it with a dozen other pieces of information, and wrote a carefully constructed article about municipal corruption that didn't mention the council member specifically, but destroyed his credibility through implication. The piece ran on Sunday. By Monday morning, the council member had resigned, citing personal reasons. Lucas read the article at my kitchen table while I watched his expression remain completely neutral. "You didn't use the material I gave you," he said. "No. I used information I verified independently that didn't require me to publish information that would directly trace back to your source. You protected me. I protected my profession," I corrected. "There's a difference." But we both knew there wasn't. I'd had the opportunity to publish something that would have damaged his operations, or at least complicated them. And I'd chosen not to. I'd made a choice that was actively against my training, against my instinct for investigative completeness, against the person I'd been before the hotel suite. This became the pattern. Lucas would provide sensitive information. I would verify it through other channels. I would publish pieces that used the verified information, but didn't require attribution to him. Each article weakened the Ndrangheta's position, while simultaneously deepening my complicity in Lucas's agenda. Each article also made it clearer to both of us that I'd crossed a line I couldn't recross. During week 5, Gabriel called and asked to meet me at the hotel. He arrived with coffee and the kind of expression that suggested he'd been conscripted into a conversation he didn't want to have. "My brother is becoming attached to you," Gabriel said without preamble. "He's using me for information leverage. He's doing that too. But he's also becoming attached." Gabriel stirred his coffee methodically. "I need to tell you something about him, about why he maintains such careful distance from people." I listened while Gabriel explained what I already knew in outline. The woman he loved, the accident, the decision afterward to turn distance into doctrine. He warned me that Lucas translates love into control, not cruelty, but containment, a way to keep catastrophe from repeating. It was less a revelation than a confirmation of the pattern I'd been living inside. I didn't feel shocked so much as sordid. What Gabriel offered wasn't a twist in the narrative. It was index cards going into the right box. Grief explained the doctrine. Doctrine explained control. And control, as I'd already learned, was Lucas's preferred synonym for love. That night, Lucas arrived later than usual. He looked exhausted in a way that suggested the exhaustion was internal rather than physical. He sat at the kitchen table without moving for several minutes, just existing in the space without speaking. "Gabriel told you about her," he said eventually. Not a question. "He told me you lost someone. I lost someone I was too selfish to keep safe. There's a difference." He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city with the particular intensity of someone watching something they wanted to destroy. "I've spent 7 years not allowing anyone close enough to hurt me that way again. And then I decided to take interest in you, which was probably the worst decision I've made in a decade. I moved closer to him, but didn't touch. You're not responsible for protecting people from random accidents. I'm responsible for the consequences of the choices I make. And the choice to bring her into proximity with my world was something I made. The choice to let her work so hard that she fell asleep at the wheel was something I made. And the choice not to drive her myself or insist she rest or take any of 1,000 actions that might have prevented her death was something I made. That's not how causality works. Maybe not, but it's how guilt works. He turned to face me. I've decided I'm going to become someone different with you. Someone who doesn't hide. Someone who admits when he's terrified. And I'm terrified, Valentina. I'm terrified that if I let you matter enough, the same universe that took her will take you too. I didn't have a response that seemed adequate to the vulnerability he'd just articulated. So instead, I reached out and took his hand. He didn't pull away. He closed his eyes like the simple contact was something he'd been denying himself for 7 years. That night, we didn't move beyond that, hand-holding at the window, watching the city lights reflect off the rain that had started to fall. But something had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer someone he was using for informational advantage. I was someone he'd decided to risk believing in, and I was no longer someone who could maintain the fiction that I was here solely for professional reasons. The call came at 3 a.m, not to my phone, but to Lucas's secure line, which meant the security breach was significant enough to warrant immediate escalation. I woke to the sound of him speaking in rapid Italian to someone on the other end, his voice pitched low, but carrying the particular intensity that suggested violence was being calculated in real time. He hung up without goodbye and stood at the window of my hotel suite, looking out at the city like he wanted to set it on fire. "They know where you are," he said, without turning around. "The 'Ndrangheta. They paid off a detective in the precinct to find you. He sold the information this morning." My body went cold in the way that comes from understanding that the theoretical danger I'd been operating around had suddenly become concrete. What does that mean? It means we need to move you in the next 4 hours. They're planning a retrieval operation for tonight. I didn't ask how he knew. I'd stopped questioning the architecture of his intelligence network weeks ago. Instead, I started packing, throwing clothes into a suitcase with the mechanical precision of someone operating on adrenaline and fear. Lucas watched from the doorway without offering help, and I understood that he was processing something beyond immediate logistics. The day passed in a state of suspended reality. I worked from the suite like it was any other day, but the knowledge that people were planning to extract me from this location made every moment feel fragile. By 7 p.m., Lucas had arranged for me to move locations. Not somewhere in the city, somewhere else entirely. His property, he said, outside the urban center. Somewhere the 'Ndrangheta's reach was limited by geography and his own security infrastructure. We left the hotel through the basement parking garage in a vehicle with tinted windows and security that made airports look casual. The drive took 40 minutes, moving away from downtown toward residential neighborhoods that gradually transformed into something more rural. The property appeared suddenly. Gates first, then a long drive lined with trees, then a house that was larger than I'd expected. Modern architecture blended into the landscape. All glass and steel designed to look like it belonged there. "This is where I operate from," Lucas said as we pulled into the underground garage. "This is where I keep things I need to protect." The implication hung between us. I was now something he needed to protect. I was something valuable enough to remove from public circulation entirely. The house was sparse in the way that suggested it was designed for function, rather than comfort. Security monitors covered multiple walls. The kitchen was industrial. The bedroom he showed me was cold despite its physical comfort. I stood in the center of it and felt the weight of my situation settle around me like something I would carry permanently. "This is temporary," he said, and it was almost the first time I'd heard uncertainty in his voice. While I addressed the situation with the 'Ndrangheta, he left me alone, and I heard him downstairs for hours, speaking to people who came through the house with the particular efficiency of those accustomed to executing instructions without question. By midnight, I'd learned that the attempted retrieval had been intercepted. Lucas's security had moved against the 'Ndrangheta team before they'd even reached the hotel. The operation had been surgical. No casualties from Lucas's side. 3 men from the rival organization dead. 2 captured for interrogation. Gabriel appeared the next morning with groceries, and the particular expression of someone handling fallout he hadn't created, but now needed to manage. "He's furious," Gabriel said without preamble. "Not at you. At himself for not seeing this coming faster. That's not rational. Neither is he." Gabriel set down the groceries and looked at me directly. "I need to tell you something about my brother, about how he processes attachment and threat." We sat at the kitchen table and Gabriel explained about the girlfriend again, but with more specificity this time, about how Lucas had decided 7 years ago that proximity to him was dangerous, about how he'd built an entire infrastructure dedicated to preventing emotional connection, about how I'd somehow managed to bypass every single system he'd constructed, and now he was terrified because the woman he'd let matter had almost been taken from him. "What does he expect from me?" I asked. "I don't know. He's figuring that out himself. But I'm warning you. My brother experiences love as a need to control. It comes from a place of genuine care, but it manifests as possession." Gabriel stood to leave. "Be careful, because he's going to hurt you trying to keep you safe." That evening, Lucas found me in the garden behind the house. The property was vast enough that I could pretend I wasn't imprisoned, that I was simply choosing to be here. We stood beside a low wall where rosemary grew with the stubborn optimism of plants that don't know the word winter. Lucas rested his hands on the stone as if anchoring himself to the earth. "Control isn't love," I said. "It's just the shape fear takes when it wants to look useful. Fear keeps people alive. So does trust. So does air." I touched the rosemary. My fingers came away smelling like kitchens and summers I didn't have. "You can't lock me in a version of safety that requires me to be smaller than I am." He considered this with the gravity of a judge and the weariness of a man who hadn't slept. "Then you'll help me build something else," he said finally. "A structure that keeps you alive without convincing either of us you're a possession." "That's a terrible name for a house," I said. "We'll think of a better one." He didn't reach for me. I reached for him. The rosemary nodded in a wind I couldn't feel. "I want you to understand something," he said, moving to stand beside me. "The people who tried to take you today did so because they're willing to use you against me. They would have hurt you not despite the fact that it would hurt me, but specifically because of it. They would have made sure I knew they had you. They would have made sure I understood the cost of opposing them. And now?" I asked. "Now they understand that you're mine. That anyone who touches you will face retaliation that exceeds proportionality. That taking you is tantamount to declaring war." He paused. "I've made them understand this through methods I won't describe to you, but I want you to know that I've done it, and I'll do it again. That's not love. No, but it's protection. And I'm going to become someone who offers you protection above everything else. Even above your freedom, I suspect. Can you live with that?" I didn't answer immediately because there was no answer that was both true and acceptable. The truth was that I'd already surrendered my freedom. The truth was that I'd made choices that couldn't be unmade. The truth was that standing in his garden, knowing that violence had been orchestrated to ensure my safety, I felt something closer to gratitude than violation. "I don't know," I said finally. "Then we'll figure it out together while you stay here and write your articles and become integrated into my life in ways you haven't anticipated yet." 2 weeks at Lucas's property passed in a rhythm that felt both suspended and increasingly permanent. I worked in the study he designated as mine, publishing articles that systematically dismantled the Ndrangheta's infrastructure. Each piece I wrote drew from the documentation Lucas provided, information I verified through independent channels before publication. The newspaper had begun to notice the pattern. My editor Margaret called asking how I was accessing such comprehensive intelligence about criminal operations that supposedly operated in shadows. "I have sources," I told her, which was technically true. "Dangerous sources," she replied. It wasn't a question. All good sources are dangerous. By day 2 of week 3, the contact came through an intermediary. A postal service employee delivered an envelope containing documents that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone outside federal law enforcement. Bank records from offshore accounts. Ownership transfers that traced directly back to Ndrangheta operatives. Evidence that would have destroyed several of Lucas's operations if released. The accompanying letter was handwritten in English with an Italian accent evident in the phrasing, "Ms. Foster, we have something you want. You have something we want. A journalist with your skills could verify these documents and publish them. In exchange, we offer your safe passage out of this situation. You're currently imprisoned by someone who will eventually hurt you. We're offering freedom." I read it 3 times before showing Lucas. He was silent for a long time after I handed him the letter. Truly silent. The kind of silence that suggested calculation rather than absence of thought. When he finally spoke, his voice had shifted into something harder than I'd heard before. "They're offering you a way out," he said. "They're also offering me exposure in exchange for you. I'm not going anywhere. You should consider it. They're right about one thing. Proximity to me is inherently dangerous. You were nearly taken because of me. You're living in a security compound because of me. You've surrendered your career independence because of me. I haven't surrendered anything. I've made choices. Have you?" He moved to the window, looking out at the property that had become my world. "Or have you simply accepted a situation that became too complex to resist?" I stood and moved toward him. I could have contacted them immediately. I could have used those documents. I could have exposed your operations entirely. Instead, I'm showing them to you, which means nothing except that you've made one good choice. It doesn't negate all the bad ones. Then what do you want from me? Permission to let you go? I don't have that right. You have to decide whether staying is worth the cost." He turned to face me, and something in his expression had reorganized itself into something closer to vulnerability. "I want you to understand that staying means you're now implicated in my operations. Those documents prove that you've had access to sensitive information and chosen not to publish it. You're technically complicit in whatever crimes those documents could prove if released. I know. You're also burned as a journalist. Once the Ndrangheta realizes you rejected their offer, they'll make sure no legitimate news organization trusts you. Your career as you understood it is finished. I know that too." He closed the distance between us. "Then why?" "Because you matter more than any of it. Because I looked at their offer and felt nothing but revulsion at the idea of betraying you. Because somewhere between the restaurant and this house, and all the time in between, you became more important than my professional integrity, or my personal freedom, or my theoretical future." He kissed me then, and it was different from any kiss before. It was less possession and more surrender. His hands gentle against my face like he was afraid I might break if he wasn't careful. We moved from the study to the bedroom upstairs, and for the first time since I'd entered his world, physical intimacy felt like connection rather than conquest. Afterward, lying in the darkness of his bedroom, he traced patterns on my shoulder that seemed to be communicating something he couldn't articulate verbally. "I'm going to do something about the Ndrangheta's offer," he said quietly. "Something that makes it clear you're not available for negotiation. Something that demonstrates the cost of using you as leverage." "What are you going to do?" "Something you shouldn't ask about and won't want to know details regarding. The important thing is that the people who contacted you will understand that approaching you again is no longer viable. And the documents will be handled. You've already destroyed your professional credibility by not publishing them. Now I'll make sure destroying anyone else becomes equally impossible." Gabriel came by the next afternoon and found me in the kitchen preparing meals for the first time since arriving at the property. He watched me work with an expression that suggested he was reading something significant in the act. "He's changing," Gabriel said eventually. "Good or bad? Neither. Just different. He's usually someone who maintains absolute distance. Now he's making choices that suggest he's capable of being with someone." Gabriel sat at the kitchen table. "I want to warn you, though. When he loves someone, he becomes dangerous in different ways. Not violent toward them, but in how he structures their life. He'll build infrastructure around you. He'll monitor everything. He'll make decisions that he believes are protective, but that might feel suffocating. He already does those things. Yes, but he'll do them more intensely now, because you're not just useful to him anymore. You matter to him." By evening, I'd published an article that destroyed the credibility of 3 municipal officials who'd been cooperating with the Ndrangheta. The piece didn't mention Ndrangheta directly, but it exposed corruption networks so thoroughly that law enforcement would have no choice but to investigate. The email I received from Margaret 20 minutes after publication was simple. "Where the hell are you getting this?" The accountant called himself Rossi because men like him chose names that sounded like they had fathers. He suggested a church basement off 9th Avenue. I suggested daylight. We compromised on 4 in the afternoon, stained glass throwing fractured color across metal folding chairs. "I balance books for import businesses," he said, palms up. "I don't ask what the crates contain, but you count what the crates are worth." He slid a spiral-bound ledger across the table. The analog bravado of a man who thought paper made him invisible. The numbers mapped into the ones Lucas had shown me weeks before, except for a single column that accounted for cash I hadn't seen elsewhere. "Insurance," Rossi said, "in case a journalist needs persuading." The door opened behind me, and a man took 2 steps in with the weaponized calm of someone who didn't need to show a weapon. I didn't turn. I closed the ledger and smiled at Rossi the way knives smile. "We're done," I said, and left without taking the book. 2 hours later, a plain envelope arrived at the hotel front desk for me. Inside, a photocopy of the missing column and a note in block letters. "You were right not to take it." The photocopy was enough. Possession of the original would have been a confession I couldn't afford. Chain of possession is a kind of confession. I wasn't going to carry a crime scene around in my bag. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not without explaining things that would destroy her understanding of journalistic ethics, of my ethics, of everything I'd built my career defending. Lucas read the article at the kitchen table. He didn't comment on it, just nodded slightly like I'd confirmed something he'd suspected about me. That night, he held me closer than usual, and I understood that my choice to stay had irrevocably bound us together in ways that extended beyond emotion, into something more structural and permanent. Gabriel discovered the operational timeline through his commercial real estate contacts, men who occupied the intersection between legitimate business and criminal information networks. The call came at 4:15 in the afternoon, his voice carrying a tension I'd never heard before. He explained that sources within the police department had revealed something significant. The 'Ndrangheta had finalized their assault strategy. Not theoretical anymore. Operational. They were moving to the property with personnel and firepower intended to overwhelm Lucas's security infrastructure through calculated numerical advantage. 24 hours, possibly less. I watched Lucas process this information from my position at the kitchen table. His expression remained neutral, but something shifted in how he occupied physical space. A reorganization of his entire presence into what I'd begun to recognize as operational mode. He picked up his secure phone and began making calls in rapid Italian, each conversation brief and structured with military precision. I understood I was witnessing the beginning of something that would reshape everything that followed. That the theoretical danger I'd been existing around had finally calcified into something concrete and immediate. "We're evacuating you," Lucas said after the final call ended. "There's a secure facility north of the city. Gabriel will accompany you. You need to leave within the hour." "And you?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. "I'm going to ensure the 'Ndrangheta understands what happens when they move against me. What happens when they make the calculation that proximity to you is leverage they can exploit." Gabriel arrived within 30 minutes with a vehicle designed for security rather than comfort. It was armored in ways I'd never fully understand. Windows reinforced, interior stripped down to essentials. He didn't attempt to reassure me or explain what was happening beyond the basic logistics. We drove through the late afternoon, while Lucas remained at the property, coordinating his response through communication channels I didn't understand, and wouldn't have understood even if he'd explained them. The bunker facility appeared suddenly after we'd driven north through increasingly rural terrain. Reinforced, underground, designed to withstand significant external pressure and to contain people within its walls. Gabriel showed me to the main room, which had monitors displaying security feeds from every angle of the property we'd abandoned. He didn't try to comfort me. He moved toward the communication equipment and began setting up his own connection to the operational network. "Stay here," he said. "Don't leave for any reason. Security personnel will provide meals at regular intervals. You'll be physically safe. Emotionally safe is another matter entirely." He didn't say goodbye. He moved toward the exit, and I understood that he was returning to the property to position himself beside his brother during whatever violence was about to be orchestrated. The monitors flickered to life, and I watched the property come into view through multiple camera angles, thermal imaging, standard security feeds, perimeter sensors, all feeding information into a system designed by someone who understood that protection required knowing everything simultaneously. Voices stitched through the comms, perimeter to Gabriel, interior corridors to Sal, medical to Anna, no heroics, only assigned lanes. By 8 p.m., the first Ndrangheta vehicles appeared at the property gates. Not careful reconnaissance or the tentative probing of earlier attempts, but a direct assault. Multiple vehicles pulled up with precision that suggested military training. Armed personnel moved with practiced coordination, and I felt something in my chest constrict as I realized this was happening in real time, that the protection Lucas had promised was about to be tested against organized violence. The security feeds revealed Lucas's people responding with efficiency that matched the invaders. Precision rather than chaos. But they were outnumbered, and watching the monitors, I began to wonder if I'd fundamentally miscalculated Lucas's capacity to protect himself against something this coordinated. Then the operational scope shifted. Additional security appeared from positions I didn't know existed. Men emerging from locations I hadn't noticed during my time at the property. Gabriel moved through the property with a tablet, coordinating movements with the particular focus of someone trained to manage violence systematically. I felt something in my chest constrict watching him operate, understanding that he was putting himself between his brother and death, between me and the possibility that everything Lucas had built would collapse under pressure. The assault lasted approximately 6 hours. The security monitors showed controlled violence, precision, rather chaos or panic. Lucas's team moved against the Ndrangheta invaders with the efficiency of people who'd trained extensively for exactly this scenario, who understood that operational success required discipline and coordination under extreme stress. But around midnight, one of the primary monitors flickered and went dark. Then another. I watched the blackness spread across the screens like something was consuming the property from the outside in. An hour passed that felt like several lifetimes compressed into 60 minutes. I couldn't move. I couldn't think beyond the immediate awareness that something had gone wrong, that the controlled violence I'd been watching had shifted into something less predictable and more dangerous. Then Lucas called. "It's over," he said without preamble. The Ndrangheta's operational presence in this city has been eliminated. Their leadership structure is compromised beyond repair. We've secured all locations and secured all remaining threats. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something closer to dread, because his voice carried an undertone that suggested the victory had cost something significant. "Gabriel," I said. "Where's Gabriel?" Silence extended between us, long enough that I understood before he spoke what had happened, that the cost of neutralizing the threat had included someone I'd come to care about. "He was evacuating you when the firepower escalated," Lucas said, and I could hear something breaking in his voice for the first time. A round caught him during secondary exit procedures, shoulder penetration and through the arm. The shoulder is recovering well with medical intervention. The arm, there's nerve damage. The radial nerve sustained significant trauma. He's going to have limited functionality in his right hand. The rehab clinic smelled like lemon cleaner and determination. Gabriel learned to pick up marbles with his fingers the way toddlers do. One, then another, then a break that wasn't a break so much as a recalibration of dignity. The therapist spoke in measured verbs. Flex, extend, hold, release. She didn't say fail. She said fatigue. "They told me I might never sign my name the same way," he said, studying his own handwriting as if it were a stranger's. "What happens if a person can't recognize himself on paper?" "He recognizes himself somewhere else," I said. He tried a fork, then a pen, then the fork again. When he finally looked at me, his eyes held the particular brightness of anger looking for somewhere safe to land. "Don't let him make the whole world small around you," Gabriel said. "When he's scared, he turns houses into boxes. I know the difference between walls and shelter. Make him learn it too." I felt my breath catch somewhere in my chest, felt the weight of what he was telling me settle into my understanding. Gabriel, his constant presence, his careful warnings, his role as the intermediary between his brother and the life I'd entered. Gabriel, who'd warned me about loving someone like Lucas. Gabriel, who'd chosen to ensure my evacuation, even knowing what that choice would cost him. "Can I see him?" I asked. "He's in medical care now. By tomorrow evening you can visit." "But Valentina, you need to understand what just happened. You need to understand what my brother was willing to sacrifice to ensure you remained safe." I spent the remainder of that night watching the monitors as Lucas's people systematically removed evidence of the confrontation. By dawn, the property looked almost untouched, except for the absence of the men who would never leave it alive. The silence of the bunker pressed against me, and I understood that I'd crossed into territory where there was no returning to the person I'd been before. Gabriel looked smaller in the hospital bed, his right arm in a medical sling with equipment monitoring his vitals continuously. The doctors explained the nerve damage with clinical precision that bypassed any comfort. The bullet had caught the radial nerve, which meant potential permanent loss of function in his hand. Physical therapy might restore some capability, but complete recovery wasn't guaranteed. His career in commercial real estate, which had defined his adult existence, was now uncertain. "I wanted to protect you," Gabriel said when I took his left hand. "He couldn't focus on the operation if he was worried about you being extracted by the Ndrangheta. So I made sure you got to safety. I didn't calculate how that would impact my own safety, which was stupid. It wasn't stupid. It was brave. It was both," Gabriel said quietly. "And now I have to figure out what I'm going to be without full use of my right hand. Everything I've built is going to require restructuring." Lucas appeared in the doorway of the hospital room. He looked at his brother with an expression I couldn't fully parse. Gratitude mixed with guilt, mixed with something like helpless rage at the situation's reality. He moved to Gabriel's bedside and placed his hand on his brother's uninjured shoulder. "The Ndrangheta threat is concluded," Lucas said to both of us. "They won't recover from this. Their leadership is either dead or compromised. The smaller operations they were running here have been dismantled. You're safe now. Completely safe." But as I looked between Lucas and Gabriel, I understood that safety had cost something permanent and irreplaceable. Gabriel's arm was a visible sacrifice. My career was destroyed. Lucas's remaining capacity to maintain emotional distance was shattered. All of it had been surrendered in the process of achieving security. The question now was whether the cost was something we could integrate into our lives or something that would continue demanding payment indefinitely. 12 weeks after the confrontation, Gabriel moved through the house in carefully measured movements, his right arm still weak from the nerve damage, but gradually improving through obsessive physical therapy. He'd transformed one of the guest bedrooms into a rehabilitation space. Resistance bands, weights adapted for single-hand use, a mirror where he could watch his progress or lack thereof. Some days he moved through the exercises with determined focus. Other days he'd stand in front of the mirror and stare at his hand like it belonged to someone else entirely. Lucas and I fell into routines that felt almost domesticated compared to everything that preceded them. He worked from the study, managing operations that I no longer asked about. I worked from the dining room table, writing articles that systematically dismantled the infrastructure of corruption that had protected the Ndrangheta. Each piece was careful, verified, published under my byline, though the information came from the comprehensive intelligence Lucas provided. My editor Margaret called during week 3, her voice carrying the particular frustration of someone who'd realized their reporter had become compromised in ways that transcended normal journalistic risk. "Where are you getting this information?" she demanded. "From sources who have reasons to want the truth exposed," I said, which was technically accurate without being honest. "That's not an answer. That's evasion." "I know," I admitted, "but it's the only answer I can provide while maintaining source protection." She didn't publish 3 of my pieces because she couldn't verify the sources. She published 4 others because the information was too accurate, too damaging to ignore, too obviously true despite its mysteriously comprehensive nature. By week 4 of my confinement at Lucas's property, 2 city council members had resigned, 3 police detectives had been suspended pending investigation, and the municipal fraud investigation had expanded to encompass 43 separate cases of corruption. Gabriel joined me one afternoon while I was working on an article about police department practices and financial irregularities. He sat across from me with his right hand resting on the table, watching me write with an intensity that suggested he was processing something beyond the immediate moment. "He's different," Gabriel said without preamble. "My brother, since the confrontation. He's not softened exactly, but he's reorganized himself around you in a way I've never seen before with anyone." "That's not necessarily good," I said. "No, but it's honest. And honesty from Lucas is relatively rare." Gabriel stood and began moving toward the kitchen. "I'm going to cook dinner, all three of us. Tonight I'm going to attempt to make pasta with one functioning hand, which will either be impressive or disastrous." It took him nearly 2 hours. Lucas came down from the study and found us in the kitchen. Me chopping vegetables, Gabriel managing the pasta with his left hand while using his recovering right hand to stabilize the pot. He was sweating from the effort and the frustration, but he didn't stop. Lucas watched without offering help, understanding that assistance would have been rejection of Gabriel's insistence on remaining functional. The pasta was imperfect, the sauce too thick, the noodles slightly overcooked, but it was made by all three of us. We sat at the dining table that had become the center of our lives, and something about sharing that meal felt like confirmation of a family unit that shouldn't have worked, but somehow had. By week 8, Gabriel had achieved approximately 70% functionality in his right hand. The doctors said that was the likely ceiling. Nerve damage wasn't always reversible. He'd need to restructure his career, learn new methods, adapt his entire professional identity. But he was alive, and his arm was attached, and every day of improvement felt like a victory against the violence that had fractured him. I published an investigative series about police department corruption that directly named 8 officers who'd accepted payments from criminal organizations. 3 of them were arrested within 72 hours. The others disappeared. They either fled, or went into protective custody, or simply never reported for their shifts again. My byline was attached to all of it, which meant my credibility as a traditional journalist was destroyed. No legitimate news organization would hire me after this. I'd become too connected to the criminal underworld I'd been investigating, too compromised to maintain professional distance. Margaret called me personally to tell me the newspaper was distancing itself from my work, not firing me, because I'd technically violated no explicit rules, but reassigning me to research positions that didn't involve publication. It was corporate silence, the kind that destroyed careers without providing any grounds for legal challenge. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and she meant it. "But readers need to trust that information has been verified independently, and you've made that impossible by operating in spaces we can't ethically endorse." I didn't argue. She was right. I had become someone who operated in spaces that journalism couldn't endorse, and I'd made that choice consciously and repeatedly. Week 10 brought the final conversation with Lucas about what my life would become. We sat in the garden at sunset, watching the light distort across the property. "You need to make a decision," Lucas said. "You can stay here and become part of my operations officially. You can return to some version of normal life outside the city. Or you can find a third option that I haven't considered." "What if I stay but continue working as a journalist?" I asked. "What if I continue publishing but operate as someone who investigates corruption generally, rather than someone attached to legitimate news organizations? That would make you a blogger, essentially. Or perhaps a freelance investigator. Your credibility would be questioned." "My credibility is already destroyed," I said. "At least this way I could use what I've learned to expose things that matter. Even if it exposes me, I wouldn't publish anything that would compromise you directly. But if your operations intersect with government corruption or criminal networks that prey on civilians, I'd publish that." He was silent for a long time. Then he reached over and took my hand in a gesture that felt more significant than any words he could have articulated. "Then, we're bound together indefinitely," he said. "You as someone operating in spaces between journalism and investigation. Me as someone providing you with information that serves my interests while also serving truth. And Gabriel as the person who sacrificed to make this possible." By week 12, we'd established the final configuration of our lives. Gabriel had returned to work in a modified capacity, specializing in consulting rather than direct property negotiations. I'd launched an independent investigation platform that published long-form reporting on corruption, organized crime, and governmental malfeasance. Lucas continued managing his operations, but with the Ndrangheta threat eliminated, and municipal corruption exposed. His position in the city had become almost legitimate. I learned the practical ways a life rearranges itself around risk. Cash in envelopes, just enough to matter and never enough to tempt. Shoes that run quietly. A list of cab companies where a dispatcher would answer at 3 a.m. and tell you the driver's name like it was a prayer. Gabriel taught me single-handed knots. I taught him to dictate and ignore autocorrect's contempt. "You can't publish mercy," he said once, frustrated with his own handwriting. "No," I said, "but you can practice it." We practiced. Not because we were good, but because we were tired of the parts of ourselves that weren't. Practice didn't make us fearless. It made us legible to ourselves. We could read the shape our fear took and walk anyway. The last encounter happened at the restaurant where everything had started. The same establishment, the same corner table, the same view of the city through rain-distorted windows. Lucas and I arrived separately, and then sat together, waiting. Gabriel arrived exactly on time, his right hand still recovering but functional enough to hold a wine glass. He smiled when he saw us, and something in that smile suggested acceptance of the family we'd become. "The city's different now," Gabriel said, raising his glass. "Cleaner, in some ways. More honest about what it is. Because we stopped hiding what it was," I said. "Because we chose to expose it," Lucas corrected. And the distinction mattered. We hadn't been heroes revealing truth. We'd been people with specific interests and specific knowledge, using that knowledge in ways that aligned with our survival and our futures. The waiter brought food we hadn't ordered, because Lucas had taken care of that detail before we arrived. He'd always taken care of details, managed expectations, controlled outcomes. But somewhere between the initial dinner and now, his control had transformed from something oppressive into something I chose to accept. Gabriel left after 2 hours, claiming he needed to manage pain management in his arm. But I understood he was giving Lucas and me space to exist as something beyond family, as partners in whatever we'd constructed together. "Do you regret it?" Lucas asked as Gabriel disappeared into the rain. "Any of it?" I looked at him directly, at the man who'd orchestrated my captivity and my safety and my integration into his world, at the person who'd shown me vulnerability and then moved mountains to protect me, at the criminal who'd become the center of my existence. "No," I said. "I don't regret it." Sometimes the practice looked like nothing anyone would recognize. Counting exits without seeming to count. Letting the phone ring twice and never 3 times. Learning the names of doormen and the names they preferred to be called when they were tired. None of it was dramatic. All of it was the difference between surviving a day and setting one aside like a jar on a shelf, labeled for later. He took my hand across the table, and we sat in silence watching the city reshape itself through the window's distorted glass. The story that had begun with a dating app mix-up and ended with me becoming complicit in organized crime would never be published. It was too personal, too compromising, too true in ways that journalism couldn't accommodate. But it existed nonetheless, written in the architecture of our lives and the choices we'd made to be together despite everything that should have kept us apart.